The Public Safety Committee will come to order. Members, we have a long hearing today. We're going to go till 12. We have the meeting room till 12, and then we will recess and come back at 6 o'clock. As you know, I wanted to give everyone an opportunity, as best we can, to testify on all of these bills. We're hearing two bills this morning. House File 237, which is my bill, and Representative Schoen's House File 240, and we hope to have a brief presentation by members of NAMI on mental illness before we adjourn or recess at 12. Sorry. So let me just again explain. I've worked with the lead on this committee to try to make sure that we have an orderly process here and that it's fair. So the idea is that we have, I believe, 12 bills that have been introduced that are related to gun control. We will lay all of these bills over for possible inclusion in a gun violence prevention bill or whatever it ends up being called. And there's going to be no votes taken on this bill, which will give us an opportunity in the future to debate. The testimony that we hear may result in amendments being made to some of the bills, so this will give us an opportunity to hopefully construct a better bill that we will vote on later in February. We have some scheduling problems. I was hoping to get these done as quickly as possible this week and be done with it for now. But the State of the State address is Wednesday night, so we can't be here. But we will meet in the evening tonight and Thursday evening, if depending on how many people still want to testify. I realize for the public that's come in, especially outside of the metro area, that this could be an inconvenience for you. I just don't know what else to do here in terms of our meeting space and our time. For these bills, we have allowed 20 minutes for proponents, and we'll try to keep to that time frame. 20 minutes for opponents, and these are people that the authors of the bill have asked to speak. And so I realize there's an overflow room in 181, but the people who are proponents for House File 237 are they need to be in the room here when this bill is introduced. Dennis Flaherty, Rick Weifels, Alexander Police Department, Jerry Denon, Heather Martens, Sami Rahamin, and Pastor Gene Martin, Jason Atkins, Alan Lifson. This is on the Universal Background Check bill. And the opponents that need to be in the room for that bill are Professor Joseph Olson, Robert Dorr, Andrew Rothman, David Gross, Chris Rager, and Brian Strauss. He's coming in the evening. Do I have your folks right? Okay. Because I don't want people to have to come from 181 down here, and it would take up too much time. So, okay, so that's sort of the ground rules. As I said, except for a non-substantial amendment to get the bill in the order that the author wants, the proper motion would be that we're moving the House file and that it will be laid over for possible inclusion. This is normal practice in this committee and in other committees. Any substantive amendments will not be in order because of the 24-hour rule. And we will have an opportunity to amend this bill, whatever it looks like, at the end of February. So let me just some opening comments, and then I'll turn this over to Representative Cornish for a couple of remarks. I recognize that this is a very emotional and complex issue. Whenever you're talking about gun control or gun violence, I understand the concerns that some gun owners have about some of these bills. But let me also say that we all have a piece of the truth, and neither side has all the answers. And it's my hope that we can have a respectful debate about this issue, that we can listen to each other, that we can gather the facts, that we can agree to disagree when we must, but ultimately pass a bill that the governor will sign. Representative Cornish and I are on absolute opposite ends of the spectrum on this issue. but last year we debated a bill that he authored called the Stand Your Ground Bill on the House floor. And we did so without shouting, without casting aspersions, and we remain friends. So of members, I ask that you treat all testifiers with respect. And of the audience, I ask that you abide by the time limits and, if possible, not repeat testimony that's already been provided, and also be respectful of this process. And if need be, we will have other days where we can have informational I guess we have a few other people that need to be in this room. If you're in 181, you'll need to be down here. Sheriff Rick Stanek, Chris Woolley from Cottage Grove, and Lee Vague from Woodbury. Hopefully we can get all that done. Representative Cornish, do you have any?
Yes, Mr. Chair and members and people in the audience, I agreed to say a few words just to try to keep calm the meeting today and respectful. And my friend Representative Paymar is right. Though we are diametrically opposed on this issue, we both hope for a respectable meeting with no shouting or jeering, and have a very healthy debate. And I've tried not to show any bias today on the meeting. And one thing I would ask of the chair is just you got my okay to go ahead and enforce a strict time limit, because I don't think we can ever get through if somebody rambles on my side as well as yours. If they start to run over, that's the only way we're going to get her done. So thank you.
Thank you for your comments, Representative Cornish. And Representative Rosenthal will chair the committee now as I present House File 237.
Representative Paymar.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Members, I'd like to move House File 237 for possible inclusion in the Gun Violence Prevention Act, or the omnibus bill. I do have a oral. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. I do have a oral amendment to get the bill in the shape that I would like. So, Mr. Chair, with your permission, I would like to amend on line 1.15 that we delete the words or other lawful firearm.
Everybody get that in line .15? Delete or other lawful firearm.
And then on lines 6.14 and 6.15, after the word issued, delete the words with the 12 months immediately preceding the transfer. Mr. Chair, I think we'll need to vote on the motion.
Remember, Representative Paymar has amended his bill to get in the shape that he wants it. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Motion prevails. Representative Paymar.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Members, I'm going to be very brief and then turn this over to testifiers to try to, and I agree with Representative Cornish, we'll try to get as many people in on the bill as we can. Members, there are 30,000 firearm homicides and suicides in this country annually. The tragic mass shootings across the country have I think, raised this issue in a way that we never thought possible. But many of these people purchased their weapons legally. Since the Brady Bill in 1994, hundreds of thousands of people who are disqualified from owning weapons were barred from purchasing through background checks. House File 237 plugs several loopholes to enhance the prohibition of those who are disqualified. And who are we talking about? We're talking about felons. We're talking about offenders who have committed an act of domestic violence who are prohibited from owning due to the Lautenberg Amendment, and those who have been confined in an institution for mental illness. Those individuals are disqualified from buying pistols and automatic, semi-automatic military assault weapons. There are loopholes in this state and across the country in gun shows, in Internet sales, and private sales that need to be plugged. And our bill does that, except it does not deal with, it does not relate to family members who want to sell a weapon to another family member. So what does this do quickly? It requires additional information when applying for a transferee permit to law enforcement. It provides language on verification that the person who is applying to law enforcement is actually the person they say they are. It increases the waiting period from 5 to 7 days, and it adds a penalty to a person who knowingly transfers a weapon to someone who is disqualified from possessing. That, in a nutshell, members, is the bill, and I'd like my testifiers to now speak to it.
Hi, could you introduce yourself and your name for the record?
Good morning, Mr. Chair. For the record, my name is Dennis Flaherty, and I'm Executive Director of the Minnesota Police and Peace Officers Association, which is a rank-and-file organization representing about 8,500 officers from across the state. And I'm here today to testify in support of Representative Paymar's bill, House File 237. For us, this session is dedicated not to guns, but to preventing certain individuals from accessing them. We hope you will at least agree from the start that there are certain people that just simply should not have them. We also hope you will agree with us that now is the time for us to do more to prevent criminals and people experiencing mental illness issues from obtaining them. This bill will go a long way to help those efforts. You've all heard the term closing the gun show loophole. Well, we'd submit to you that that's not a loophole, but in fact a gaping hole that allows what has been determined to be 40% or more of handgun sales to take place through private sales, such as the Internet, across your neighbors, across the backyard fence, and from the trunks of cars. And all these sales are conducted by people who do not transact their business through a federal licensed dealer and have not obtained the necessary transfer permit that is required by law, and most importantly, did not undergo a police background check. That's the hole this bill attempts to close. It is the route that people who know they are ineligible to pass a background will travel. Right now in Minnesota, we offer two very distinct routes for a person wanting a handgun. One route requires a police background check that may take up to 7 days, or the other that allows an immediate sale with no questions asked. There should be no question in your mind where the people are going that I know you don't want to have guns. And that's what has to stop, and this bill will do just that. This is not just supported by law enforcement, and make no mistake, indeed it is supported by the overwhelming majority of law enforcement officers, but polls as recently as last month show strong public support as well for ensuring that ineligible people cannot easily obtain handguns. This position has been consistently supported, and frankly it's long overdue. Background checks are universally supported by sportsmen and hunters as well as the general public. And background checks do work. You will hear testimony on that today. And I have with me Sergeant Mark Bergeron with the Brooklyn Park Police Department, who for a living does this in terms of processing the applications that come into his department, and he can, if you so would like, kind of basically describe what a background check entails. This bill simply closes the door to so many that should not have a handgun. It's sensible and it will work. It still allows transactions to be made by private parties, neighbors, and friends, but it just requires the buyer to go to their police department, obtain a transfer permit, and then conduct the transfer through a federally licensed dealer. And it also provides exceptions in the rule for family members. There are, from what I understand, over 1,600 licensed federal dealers in the state of Minnesota. I think we even have a map that points out their locations, and you'll see that they are located throughout the state, so there are plenty of them that can do this, and they are strategically located throughout Minnesota and every region of our state. It allows police to initially deny a permit to those they know had been confined for mental illness reasons. That decision, of course, like all permit decisions, can be later appealed, and if the court, after receiving advice from mental health professionals, feel those problems no longer exist, can order the permit issued. Make no mistake about it, we're not doing enough to protect the citizens of our state from gun violence. Let me repeat that. We are not doing enough to protect the citizens of our state from gun violence. We're not doing enough to prevent people who, for a host of reasons, simply should not possess a handgun from getting them. We're not stopping them. This is the public safety bill of this session. I strongly urge you to join virtually all of law enforcement and support this measure. I do have a number of colleagues from law enforcement. I'd like Dave Picha from the Chiefs of Police to come up. And again, I do have the sergeant here that can, okay, we're going to hear from him. If you want to.
Thank you, Mr. Flaherty. We have about 10 minutes left for this portion. Can you state your name for the record, please?
My name is Mark Bergeron, Bergeron.
Welcome to the
Brooklyn
committee.
Park Police Department.
Mr. Bergeron.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, thank you for having me here today. Mr. Flaherty asked me to come to kind of give some background to the committee about how the background process check works. In Brooklyn Park, the applicants must be made in person. All applicants come up to the police department, fill out an application, and show a current state identification, either driver's license or ID card. If they're non-U.S. citizens, they show a supporting document that they're legal residents. After the permits are received, the applications are received, they're given a receipt as required by law, and then the paperwork is handled by one of our police clerks. The clerk runs the checks, all the necessary checks through the BCA computer, which would include a criminal history check through the state, runs through the FBI, Minnesota driver's license files. There's also checks done through the state court system, through Odyssey is the system. There's also a statewide supervision check through probation, predatory offender check, and the check also through the BCA computer does a check through the Department of Human Services. If the Department of Human Service comes back with what's called a possible match, then we fax in a release and they do a manual check at the DHS and notify us of those results. The clerk does all that and looks over the paperwork. Also, all Brooklyn Park records are checked as well for any potential disqualifiers. So the clerk does that and identifies anything that appears to be a red flag. Then I look over everything as well. So we've always got two sets of eyes looking at the documents and double checking. I will then give the approval and sign the application, sign the permit, or else I'll write up a denial letter if denial is required. And sometimes we do deny people. People submit applications. Some people do disclose their previous felony convictions. Sometimes they think the time has expired so they can get a permit. Other people have things that, one such example would be a gal I denied, in fact, last week. She, earlier, a few months ago, late part of 2012, she tried to commit suicide and been placed on a 72-hour hold by our police department. and she had ingested pills and slit her wrists. At that time, her boyfriend told the police that if she had made the statement that if she had a gun, she would have shot herself. Well, she was now applying for a permit to purchase a firearm 3 months later. And based on that previous police report and contact with our police department, I disqualified her at this time. So.
Thank you, Mr. Bergeron. I welcome the committee. Could you state your name for the record?
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, I'm Dave Peacher, the Executive Director of the Minnesota Chiefs of Police Association, standing in for Chief Rick Weifels, who is our president. With me today are also additional chiefs from our association, including Chief Dave Kolb, the co-chair of the Legislative Committee, so I will make my comments very brief so that Chief Kolb could come up and testify, as well as Executive Commander Ken Reed of the St. Paul Police Department, if the chair would allow.
Thank you.
Hopefully all the members of the committee have received the Minnesota Chiefs of Police Association policy on firearms. If not, I'd be more than happy to distribute that to you. I was told that it was in your packet. This policy was vetted by our legislative committee, which includes over 20 chiefs from throughout the state of Minnesota, and then ratified by the Minnesota Chiefs of Police Association Board. That includes 15 chiefs from throughout the state of Minnesota. This was ratified unanimously, and this is a foundation for our policy positions moving forward. Specifically to House File 237, I'd like to invite Chief Dave Kolb of the Champlin Police Department.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Welcome to the committee. Could you state your name for the record?
My name is David Kolb, K-O-L-B. I'm the police chief at Champlin, and I'm here representing the State Chiefs Legislative Committee. Mr. Chair, I'll be brief. There are several pieces of this legislation that we think are good for public safety. I just want to point out one small piece in that Sergeant Bergeron talked about background checks for handgun applicants. Police departments spend a great deal of time and resources processing those. One of the features of this bill that we favor is the ability to charge a reasonable fee for people who are making those applications. We cannot uncover the problems in these backgrounds if we don't devote proper staff time to doing so. That takes time and that takes resources, and we believe a reasonable fee is only fair to charge for that service. I would like to give some time to Chief Benner from the Brooklyn Center Police Department, who has a very good example of this issue with who gets the guns and how these background checks are necessary.
Thank you, Chief Cole. We have about 5 minutes left.
Give the opposition time.
Yeah.
Chair, if we go a little bit, if we go a little bit over, we'll give the opponents the same amount of time. Okay.
Yes.
My name is Chief Kevin Benner from the Brooklyn Center Police Department, and I come to share with you an incident that happened in 2012 in Brooklyn Center, specifically related to this bill. In 2012, Brett Struck was violently killed by a woman who had stalked him for 5 years. The woman is Rochelle Inselman. She was recently sentenced and convicted for murder in 2012. Rochelle Inselman was a prohibited person not able to acquire a firearm. She went to her law enforcement agency, tried to get a permit to acquire a firearm while plotting to kill an ex-boyfriend from 5 years ago. She was denied that permit. However, she was able to find a second-party dealer who lawfully sold her a handgun, a 9mm handgun, which she used to commit this crime. Again, I add that it took her 5 years plotting this murder. She tried to get the gun legally through the law enforcement. They did their job. She was denied the permit. However, she was able to acquire this firearm. That's my testimony. Thank you.
Thank you, Chief.
Oh, sorry. Were there any questions? I apologize.
No. Okay. Not this time.
Ready? Good morning, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. My name is Kenneth Reed. I'm a commander with the St. Paul Police Department. I'm here on behalf of Chief Tom Smith and the Minnesota Chiefs Association.
Welcome to the committee.
We are here in support of this legislation today because it addresses a number of items that we've been wrestling with, Chief Smith has been wrestling with, in terms of approving acquisition permits and acquisition of firearms and transfer of firearms to people that we later find out should have never had them in the first place. The permit process has been described to you here this morning. I can tell you that in 2011, we handled 1,384 gun permit transactions, and in 2012 that number jumped up to 1,897. It's a burden that we've been wrestling with. It takes a lot to do with those clerks running all the various local, state, and federal background checks and that we need to make decisions. And this legislation, in particular the areas dealing with mental health information and substance abuse information, are greatly appreciated from our standpoint as we've been wrestling with those issues. So that's why we're here in support of this legislation today.
Thank you, Commander Reed.
Is there any questions?
Okay, Representative Pamar, we have about 2 minutes.
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, I'll be brief. Jeff Bean, the chief of the Rogers Police Department, been in law enforcement 33 years, formerly the chief at the Elk River Police Department. I've been processing gun permits for approximately 14 years. The one loophole that I think many chiefs have great concerns about is that you have to be court committed to a mental institution before we can deny someone from obtaining a firearm permit to acquire. What about the 72-hour hold, the suicidal individual that others have referenced the night before? What about that individual in our city where we've had 60 calls in the last 12 months where they're hearing voices through walls, they put tinfoil up on their windows, they're convinced that God is coming to them telling them to buy a firearm and to do things, yet they've never been committed to an institution. That's a person I'm going to give a permit to acquire for. Prior to 2009, chiefs had the ability to stop that from happening. I think one of the things we're encouraging you is to look at widening those mental health checks. I want to say in closing that if you look at our shootings across the United States in the last year, they've not been committed by criminals. They've been committed by people who are mentally ill, 9 out of 10. Sheriff Stanek and the President talked about yesterday. So we need some latitude on the local level to be able to protect our communities, and that's what I would encourage the committee to look at. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair, we just have a couple more testifiers, and then we'll be done, and then we'll give whatever time we took over our 20 minutes to the opposition. So I believe Mr. Ramamem is next.
Welcome to the committee. Could you state your name for the record, please?
Samuel, S-A-M-U-E-L, Rahamim, R-A-H-A-M-I-M. Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. Nothing prepares you to hear the news that your father has been murdered with a gun. On September 27th, 2012, I was taking a bus by myself to go visit a friend in future school, University of Wisconsin-Madison. My mom dropped me off at the bus at roughly 4 p.m. that day. About 30 minutes later, I saw an early report of a shooting in the Bryn Mawr neighborhood of Minneapolis where my father had built his business, Accent Signage. My father was an immigrant living the American dream, extremely proud that all of his products and materials were produced in the USA. He created dozens of jobs over the years, invented a system of Braille that made it easier for blind people to read, and exported products all over the world, including, as he loved to tell people, China. I sent a text message to my dad that day telling him that I heard that there had been a shooting in the Bryn Mawr area and to stay away and be careful. Of course, what I did not know at the time was that this text to my dad would go unanswered because just shortly before, he had been shot twice in the head at the company he had built. This is something I will go to bed knowing every night and wake up knowing every day. The final 4 hours of that bus ride felt closer to 40 hours as every possible scenario went through my head. I've described it as a hyper-localized version of 9/11 where you feel like you are under attack, yet there is so much chaos and confusion that you cannot even begin to fathom what is going on. Harsh reality soon set in, and there still isn't 10 minutes where I don't think about the terror brought upon myself, my family, Accent Signage, and the local community. The gunman killed 6 fathers that day, all of them leaving behind a total of 15 children far too soon. The key factor about the gun violence legislation introduced in this legislative session is this: it will save lives. The gun used to kill my father and 5 other fathers that day had a capacity of 15 rounds. A law limiting a capacity to 10 rounds might have saved lives. The private sale loophole undermines the background check system by allowing millions of gun buyers to avoid checks by simply obtaining their guns from private sellers. According to the most recent national survey, an estimated 40% of U.S. gun sales are conducted between private citizens with no federal requirement that the buyer first pass a background check. Few states track private sales, but recent data suggests that these unregulated purchases are becoming more common. For example, Michigan State Police stated that 48% of state handgun purchases are conducted privately, which amounts to more than 50,000 private party handgun sales in Michigan each year alone. Criminals exploit the private sale loophole to obtain guns. A national survey of inmates found that nearly 80% of those who used a handgun in a crime acquired it in a private transaction. And secondly, the Internet has made a vast marketplace for guns where millions of buyers and sellers can easily identify one another and conduct firearm transactions in almost total anonymity. While legislation cannot prevent every gun death, it has a moral obligation to attempt to save as many lives as possible. I want my story told so that other families will not have to go through the devastation that mine has experienced. My dad lived the American dream, but died the American nightmare. Gun violence kills 33 Americans every day, and more than 12,000 Americans will lose their lives to gun violence over the next year if no action is taken place to stop the gun violence epidemic. Many of these gun deaths are preventable, but under the current policies, the United States has the highest per capita rate of firearm-related murders of all developed countries. We can do better than that.
Chair, I think we have one more testifier and then we're done. Okay. So, Mr. Chair, I think we're done for now. We'll the other testifiers will testify on the next bill. So, I don't know if you want to ask any questions
members?
at this point.
Representative Cornish.
Mr. Chair, members, I'm not going to take up enough time because I think that my testifiers will blow enough holes in these misstated facts and percentages and quotas here that to last a lifetime. But the 40% is just a myth. To say that they're directly related to not having run through gun checks is just not true. Another peace officer got up there and said we aren't doing enough. We aren't doing enough because the legislators won't let us do enough. If we want to arm teachers, we want to have armed security guards, we want to put a shooter in the scene that could actually do something, legislators are saying no and pretending these worthless gun bills are going to do any good, which they don't. The one police officer said they were able to disqualify a person. Why did you testify then? You were able to disqualify the person. You don't need any more gun laws. And the thing about the person taking 5 years to commit murder should convince some of you in here that that's the whole point. You're not going to stop some of these people from committing murder. No matter how many of these gun laws you apply, that's how intense they are in doing it. I could tell you the stories about a woman in my area that tried to commit suicide a number of times until she was successful. So some of these if things, we could go on forever about what might happen. I will challenge the chiefs to say that they do not represent frontline officers in the vast majority. They just do not. They represent city councils and they represent mayors. The people in the front lines, I've got scores of letters. We've got some active duty cops out here that want to testify today, but we won't have time. And it was sad personally for me to see all those officers line up in bleachers behind President Obama and give credence to gun control laws that won't do any good. So anyway, I'm going to give the rest of my time to the testifiers here and talk about some of these abhorrent statistics that we're throwing out there that just are misstated and not true.
Representative Newberger.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My name is Jim Newberger. I am as some of my fellow committees know, that I am a paramedic. I've been one full-time for 25 years in North Minneapolis. 4 of the officers that were down here, I currently I work with their departments. The concern that I have is the way that this is being addressed towards what they call 72-hour hold forms. I have a stack of 72-hour hold forms in my ambulance. When they are very subjective. And first and foremost, I want to clarify something. The hold forms that the officers sign do not say 72 hours on them. They are transport holds. These are holds for us to take someone who is mentally ill. And what are the criteria? Threat to self or threat to others. Those transport holds are for us to take people from the scene to an emergency room. And oftentimes those emergency rooms have mental health capacities. They have units inside the hospital. I can tell you that I have transported thousands of people on transport holds. what some people here are mistakenly calling 72-hour holds. I have transported thousands of people on these holds, and I can tell you that often that those holds are being signed by officers who are, their systems are stressed, and they just want these people out of the area. They want them out of the scene. They want them away from the family. Good judgment calls, yes, but according to the criteria of this bill, these people, if you're having a family stress situation, if you're having an alcohol situation, if you're having suicidal ideations, you get put on a transport hold, you get brought to a hospital, now all of a sudden you can't own a gun? What we are doing here is we are creating a second class of citizens. A second class that says once you are mentally ill, you are always mentally ill, and therefore you shall not have the right to defend yourself. I look at this and I see this as an egregious attack on the Second Amendment. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Newberger. I'd just like to remind the committee that these bills are being laid over. We will have time to take them up, and a lot of people have come a long way to testify.
Okay, Mr. Chair, I believe that unless there's other questions, that's it for the proponents, and we can hear from the opponents.
Anybody wishing to speak against the bill? Welcome to the committee. Could you state your name for the record, please?
My name is Andrew Rothman. I'm the Vice President of the Gun Owners Civil Rights Alliance, a Minnesota organization that has stood for 24 years in support of Minnesotans' constitutional rights. I'm here to very briefly address some statements that have been made and statements which unfortunately are inaccurate. The first one is that Mr. Rahamim said that the most recent studies say that 40% of guns are transferred without a background check. The study that Mr. Rahamim is referring to was conducted 20 years ago. It was of 251 people, and 3/4 of that survey were conducted before the Brady check was put into place. The true numbers are nothing like that. Second, we had police chiefs here say that the police need to make decisions about who should get a permit and who should not. That is incorrect. The police chief's job under 64.713/7131 is not to make decisions. It is to administer the law. They do not have the discretion to decide for themselves. And the reason that they don't have that discretion is because they have greatly abused that discretion. Prior to 2003, the police chiefs greatly abused the discretion where if you lived in Minneapolis, you would not get a carry permit. If you lived in a rural area, you would. The law should be objective and fair and universal throughout the state. Mr. Rahamim also talked about anonymous sales on the Internet. I believe that he knows, and I think that everybody on the committee should know, that no long-distance sale, no mail-order sale, no FedEx sale can be conducted over the Internet. That is a violation of federal law. Private sales can occur, but they cannot. There is an illusion that people are trying to tell you that people can order a gun and it's going to arrive in their mailbox, and nothing could be further from the truth. Mr. Rahamim also suggested that criminals have been exploiting the lack of background check on a private sale to purchase their weapons. And that's absolutely true. Criminals purchase guns from other criminals. They steal guns. That's because they're criminals. And these criminals who get their guns without a background check, they wouldn't be able to get a gun with a background check. And so they don't. They break the law. They're already felons if they decide to purchase a gun, so of course they get it through private sales. If you decide to charge me $25 to my police chief to go get a transfer permit, and then charge me another $25 or $50 to go down to the gun shop to transfer a gun, well, now I'm paying $75 to transfer a $100 gun, and that doesn't make a lot of sense. It won't stop the criminals, but it will put an unfair damper on a constitutional right to keep and bear arms.
Thank you, Mr. Rothman.
Next up, Christopher Rager from the National Rifle Association.
You changed. Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, my name is Joseph Olson. I'm a professor of law at Hamline University. I am, of course, not appearing in that capacity today. I am here as the president of the Gun Owners Civil Rights Alliance, and I want to talk about House File 237, which actually does two things. It's a background check bill with serious due process problems, but even worse, hidden in it is a universal registration scheme for firearms that are covered by it. You have to go through a federally licensed dealer. The federally licensed dealer has to treat the sale as if he was making it, which means that you have all of the paperwork, the 4473 as we call it, which will be filled out, which is kept forever, initially by the dealer and eventually by the ATF, and which is only that far away from being a computer linkage system between the gun and the gun owner. And every place we have seen registration, in Australia, in the United Kingdom, for example, when registration comes, confiscation doesn't come far behind it. There is no need for the registration. We had testimony 2 years ago by one police officer after another, including some of those that we've seen here today, testifying about how absolutely wonderful the Minnesota background check system is and how bad the federal NICS system is. Well, if you go through a dealer, you go through the federal NICS system. If you go to your local police chief and you get the Minnesota background check, you get a little card that says you're good for a year. You can buy all the guns you want. You can buy them from anybody you want because you have been cleared. There is no trail, but you have a form. We could simply use that form, and you have to show it to whoever you buy a firearm from, which most people do already today in Minnesota, and that's it. The transaction is done. The background check has been completed. The bad guys have been restricted from getting firearms, although there will always be someone who slips through. But we don't have a registration system hidden in the middle of the bill. Additionally, we have the problem which Representative Newberger mentioned. I, too, spent 20 years as a paramedic on a volunteer fire department. I worked 2 years as a volunteer in St. Louis, and to get put on a hold and transported to the hospital for examination by a physician requires virtually no evidence at all. It simply requires a signature by someone who can do it. In Minnesota, it's a police officer. In other states, it can be an EMT themselves. The determination happens at the hospital. And I will tell you, I have seen people brought in by the dozens. They talk to the psychiatrist. The psychiatrist says, "You're having a really bad week, aren't you?" And the person says, "Yes." The psychiatrist says, "Don't you think 2 6-packs was too much?" And the person says, "Yes, it really was." And he says, "Would you like to sleep overnight here and go home in the morning?" And the person says, "What a wonderful idea." And they go home in the morning. They were never insane. They were never chemically dependent. The appropriate person determined so. When the law was changed in 2009 to put a judicial determination in, it was done because the Minnesota practice had always been to read confined or committed as if it said by a judicial determination. That wasn't the change in the law. That was an introduction of due process into a system which has none. If you want to transport someone to the hospital on a transport hold and get a physician to look at them, that's one thing. But if you want, because you're standing on the side of the road and it's raining and you want to get rid of them, you want to have them confined under one of these categories, that's simply wrong. It's a complete denial of due process. And we really shouldn't do that. So 2 problems with the bill, well, 1 little problem. I don't have the numbering system, but somewhere in 624-7131 subdivision 5, it says 7 days. And in order to be consistent with the rest of the bill, it should probably say 7 business days. But the problem with this bill isn't the background check. The problem with this bill is the hidden registration. The problem with this bill is the lack of due process on mental confinement orders. And there's another problem with the bill, which is interference with interstate commerce. The federal government regulates firearms as well as Minnesota. The federal government has a very clear definition of what is an antique firearm. And the United States is filled with manufacturers, collectors, and others who regularly trade and sell in antique firearms. And if you look at line 5.19 through 5.20, we would create a trap for the unwary in Minnesota by making those firearms covered by the modern firearms law that we have, rather than left the way it is under state law. And one other thing I'd like to ask you to look at, I spotted this on the last page in section 18. It says knows or has reason to know. Well, as you learn in first-year law school, we have deliberate, we have knowing, we have reckless, we have gross negligence, we have negligence, we have a whole hierarchy of states of mind. The problem is when you say knows, you start out up here. And then when you say should have known, you immediately drop down to negligence. So if you mean known, say known. If you mean has reason to know, say so. But don't say both, because they're inconsistent with each other. So with that, I will turn my time over to the next speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Olson. We actually have a couple of questions for you. Representative Lesh.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Professor Olson, my first session here was the same first session as Representative Cornish, 2003, when we passed that law, in which you were really active for the carry provisions of it.
Yes.
And the previous testifier had stated prior to that, if you lived in a more rural area, you got your permit. If you lived in an urban area, it was routinely denied. And I wonder, now that we have a statewide standard, now that you can carry anywhere because it's a shall issue provision in that law, do you see any consequences of foisting a rural standard upon the metro area that may not be as comfortable with it? With the debate that we're having right now over this bill and subsequent bills, when you were very involved with that law in 2003, do you see any consequences of your actions from 2003 that now a huge percentage of the population that was satisfied with giving up certain freedoms because they're crammed together in an urban area or a metro area are now uncomfortable with the results of that?
Well, I don't think they're uncomfortable with the fact that there is a must-issue carry permit system, generally speaking, but not entirely. Carry permit holders are very, very law-abiding. The state of Florida has some numbers going back 25 years. They have issued over 2.5 million permits. They have revoked 165 of them for a crime after licensure with a gun. So yes, permit holders aren't perfect. Transferee permit holders aren't perfect. Carry permit holders aren't perfect. I hate to say this, but police officers aren't perfect. No one is. But we have a system that's worked. We have a system that's worked in Minnesota for 10 years. and I don't think it's a system that we should change.
Well, and Mr. Chair, just by way of final comment, I appreciate you, Professor Olson, answering that. I think what we have here is a perception problem. People are slinging different statistics in different ways because they're viewed in different ways. So I think until that perception problem of what is dangerous in what areas is resolved, we're going to have this ongoing debate. But thank you for your answer.
Thank you. We have one more question. Representative Schoen, I'd just like to remind everybody that we have a lot of people here to testify. If you could keep your comments brief.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to clarify a statement. Mr. Olson, did I hear you say that police use an emergency hold, which is state statute 253B.05, because they want to get people out of the rain?
If you heard that, it wasn't what I meant. There are statutory requirements that have to be met. I have practiced as an EMT both in Minnesota and in Missouri, and in the city of St. Louis, they do things with a lot more slack than they do in Minnesota.
Okay, so we do pretty well in Minnesota? Mr. Chair, I'm sorry. We do pretty well in Minnesota because when I'm working as a police officer and a paramedic, I have never taken someone that has just been out in the rain that hasn't need services and taken them to the hospital just because I don't want to deal with them. And I just want to make that perfectly clear to the crowd that that's not what an emergency hold is for. And when we get to the 72-hour hold provision in there, yeah, it is not a 72-hour hold form, but that is where the 72 hours comes from, is for the review. When somebody actually needs mental health services, it is a fairly decent standard. And when they go to get the evaluation and the treatment that they need, it's because they need it.
Well,
thank you, Mr. Chair.
Olson.
The point I was making was that the consequences, if any, should be triggered by the physician or psychiatrist's diagnosis at the hospital.
Thank you.
I never had any mental health training, and I don't suspect any other EMT has either.
Thank you for your testimony, Professor. Welcome to the committee. Could you state your name for the record, please?
Sure. My name is Chris Brager, and I'm with the National Rifle Association. There's a number of things that we oppose in this legislation, but I just want to briefly touch on two of the issues. A lot of them have already been covered thus far, but one is the removal of a fundamental right without due process, and we think that's definitely unacceptable. What this provision does, it removes a judicial determination that you could be prohibited from possessing a firearm and lessens that standard down to simply having a hospitalization. Now, there's been some talk about 72-hour holds and things of that nature, but I'm concerned about individuals who have, for instance, maybe been hospitalized for an eating disorder, or an Iraq vet that's come back from war that has voluntarily sought out help and has thus been hospitalized. Situations like that where there is no due process, and I'm not really sure how far back that hospitalization would take place as well. So if someone had alcohol problems and was hospitalized for that decades before, is that a retroactive prohibition on their right to possess and carry a firearm? So that's definitely a potentially troubling provision for us. And the next I would like to touch on are the universal background check provisions. And obviously the National Rifle Association opposes that provision that's in this bill. And like some of the other testifiers have mentioned, that gun registration is something that is a concern for us. And people have asked, why do you oppose that provision? And there are many people who disagree with having their firearms tracked, taxed, and eventually even taken, for that matter. But I've also heard the stat thrown around by Representative Paymar and some other folks up here about the 40%. Well, the study that was taken from was looking at a Clinton-era study where there was no requirement of a federal background check at the system, and they also included inheritances and gifting of firearms to come to that stat. And it's my understanding that it's likely that less than 10% of all firearm sales are done through a private transfer. Now, that being said, I think it's important to point out that there is no private sales loophole. Americans have always been allowed to occasionally sell or trade firearms through private transfers in accordance with all state and federal laws. I think it's important to note that private sales are the exception and not the rule. And it's also important to note that firearm ownership here in the United States is at an all-time high, and violent crime is at an all-time low. The universal background check systems would never be universal, and the reason being because criminals would never submit to a background check. Only law-abiding individuals are impacted by these regulations. Not surprisingly, despite extensive research, there's no study that has shown that an expanded background check system leads to a reduction in violent crime. Universal background checks would only be an inconvenience for some law-abiding citizens, and the delays and complications could lead to increases in violence. Universal background checks are also unenforceable and, like I said, could lead to registration. For the universal background check to work in some of the minds of individuals, there would need to be a way to track those firearms, and without a state-level registration scheme, it would be impossible to track those firearms. And the only way for a law enforcement officer to know if someone had a background check on a firearm or not would be on the back end when there's a crime committed with those firearms, because there's no way for the state-level law enforcement to have access to the NICS check system. So short of a registration scheme, there's no way to enforce a universal background check provision. I think it's also important to point out that there's no such thing as a gun show loophole, and like I said, there's no such thing as a private sales loophole because Americans have always been able to occasionally sell firearms. And if you're engaged in the business of selling firearms, you're required to have a federal license to do so, and not having that federal license would have you facing a felony-level prosecution. Gun shows aren't the source of crime guns. A Bureau of Justice Statistics report has shown that less than 1% of U.S. crime guns come from gun shows. So I guess the biggest question is, where are these guns coming from? Where are the criminals getting these guns? And the answer to that is theft, it's black market transactions, and it's straw purchases. So I think it's important as we review this legislation that we actually start thinking about real solutions and how we're going to cut down on bad guys from getting guns. And I think one of those ways is to look at one of the major ways they're getting those guns now, and that's through straw purchases. And that's an individual who goes to a gun show or goes to a store and purchases a firearm with a clean background check for someone that's prohibited from possessing that firearm. And that's something that cracking down on that type of transaction is something that the NRA definitely supports and would be more than willing to work with Chairman Paymar. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony. We have about 3 minutes left. Welcome to the committee. Could you state your name for the record, please?
Yes, my name is Rob Dorr, D-O-A-R. I am a permit to carry instructor here in Minnesota. I'm also a DNR hunter safety instructor. And a few things in this bill that concern me. One in particular is that it requires all loans that are exceeding 1 day to go through an FFL transfer. And as a firearm safety instructor, hunter safety instructor, there have been times where I've loaned my target rifles, 22 rifles, to students to practice. In between class sessions, sometimes the class sessions go for up to 8 weeks. So I will, if they need some practice, many of these guys are rural guys and they've got their own land, of course, with their parents' supervision. Some of these guys are grown adults who go through the class. I will loan my firearms to them at a cost of $25 for each transfer. And then I'm not sure who retains ownership of that or if I will ever get those guns. I think that's an unnecessary potential unforeseen consequence of the bill. Also, as a permit to carry instructor, I use corporate guns for our carry classes, and we also do law enforcement training. We do advanced firearms training. We have a wide variety of firearms that we encourage our people to train with so that they're familiar. I don't personally own those; those are owned by the business. There's no provisions in here that specify a business owning the firearms versus a private individual. And then my last point is just to talk about. We talked about a little bit about how many sales and where they're coming from. Let's look at how the criminals are getting the guns. Mr. Rager previously just mentioned that less than 1%, it's 0.8%, a Department of Justice study from over 18,000 criminals. And of that, 0.8% of them were sourced directly through a gun show, through this potential gun show loophole. So I submit to you that we're not looking in the right places. And we'll wrap up our testimony. I want to give you a little bit of an anecdote. Imagine a police officer comes across a person who's fervently searching underneath the streetlight, looking in the bushes, looking underneath the streetlight. Police officer comes up and asks him, "What are you doing here?" He's like, "Oh, I'm looking for my keys." He's like, "Oh, okay. Well, where are they?" He says, "I dropped them in the alley over there." And the police officer says, "Well, why are you looking here?" And the man replies, "Well, the light's better here." The problem is you guys are looking where the problem isn't, and you're focusing where the light is because it's easier. What you have to do is do your job and find where the problem is and address it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Moore. Representative Paymore.
Mr. Chair, I think we've given time for both sides. I know people want to testify, and we can take more testimony this evening on this bill, but we need to move on to the second bill, so I'm ready just to offer a closing 30 seconds and lay the bill over.
Okay, Mr. Paymore. People in the audience, if you have written comments, we urge you to turn them into the committee. Representative Paymore.
Mr. Chair, I just thank the committee for hearing the bill and for the testifiers. Again, a complex issue. More than happy. I've worked with Mr. Olson before. I'm happy to work with the NRA on any issues to make this a better bill. I would draw the attention to members that Section 2 of the bill talks about restoration of a person's right to possess a firearm, so I don't think that the due process issues that have been raised are legitimate concerns. With that, Mr. Chair, I would move that I would ask that the Chair lay over House File 237 as amended.
Thank you, Representative Paymore. I move that House File 237...
You just lay it, if you could just lay it over, that would work fine.
House File 237 is laid over.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members. Members, the next bill on the agenda is House File 230. Representative Schoen. I'm sorry, 240. Representative Schoen.
Mr. Chair, I'd like to move House File 240 be included in the pending omnibus safety bill.
Please proceed.
All right. Members, the arguments related to firearm safety are vast. I want to make it very clear that this bill is not about banning any guns, any magazines. This is related to a local issue. We have other bills that will be presented with us or to us that will deal directly with guns. That issue has divided many communities. One issue that has found common ground is any issue related to mental health and preventing those with untreated mental illness to obtain a gun. Gun groups agree we need to prevent those who fit in this category from obtaining a firearm and making sure that we treat those individuals who need it. We count on our local law enforcement to know their communities and help us be safe. This bill allows local law enforcement to use the information they develop on a daily basis while responding to calls to request someone get further review prior to be granted a permit to carry or purchase a firearm. One of those examples would be the untreated chemical dependency issues, several calls for a check the welfare where an individual might be hearing voices but hasn't been treated. And I'll go back to exactly the point that the Rogers police chief made is the tinfoil hats, albeit extreme, but when you have that in your local community, those local officers that are here today need that opportunity to ask for further review. This is not about trying to prevent them from getting it. This is about making sure they're safe when they do. With that, I'll turn it over to Sheriff Rich Stanek, Mr. Chair.
Thank you.
Sheriff, welcome back to a committee that you knew well.
Yeah, please. Well, Mr. Chair, members, thanks very much for having me back. It's always a pleasure to come testify in the House, and I know as you begin your new year, you've got a number of bills before you, and I really appreciate, as a sheriff of this county and being a former member here, I know how difficult it is to take on a discussion like this and try and find what the right thing to do is on behalf of the people of Minnesota. And I have full faith and confidence that you will wind your way through this over the next several days, several weeks, several months to do what's right for the folks here, and I appreciate that, Mr. Chair. Having said that, good morning. My name is Rich Stanek. I'm sheriff in Hennepin County, Minnesota. I'm going to make my comments brief, Mr. Chair. As I mentioned, I know you have a very full agenda this morning, and many people who want to weigh in on these important issues of public safety. First, I'd be remiss if I didn't thank Representative Dan Schoen for bringing this bill forward and beginning the discussion at the legislature on the intersection of issues relating to mental health and extreme gun violence. Mr. Chair, members, make no mistake about my position. I believe gun ownership isn't a privilege. It's a right guaranteed by the Constitution first and foremost. And having said that, in the Sheriff's Office, we've been focusing much time over the last year reviewing issues of mental illness and our criminal justice system. I authored 2 different commentary pieces in the Star Tribune to try and begin the discussion with the people of Minnesota, and particularly elected officials, the policymakers, you yourselves, about this. A couple weeks ago, Representative Schoen and Lesh joined me and other law enforcement leaders in a press conference upstairs to announce a broad, bipartisan group who have agreed to take a look at the issues of mental illness and gun violence. And we listed a number of possible reforms, but we also said the list was not comprehensive and other ideas will be coming forward because that's what happens in the public policy-making process. I know the discussion continues today with this House File 240. Mr. Chair, members, hopefully in your packet was a letter that looked something like this. And if not, we will provide it to the committee. I know we got it, I think, to the committee administrator, so hopefully it made it in your packet. But nonetheless, I'm not going to go through this. It's self-explanatory. This is what we talked about a couple weeks ago. I will say, though, that law enforcement in this state, the Minnesota Police and Peace Officers Association, the Minnesota Chiefs of Police Association, and the Minnesota Sheriff's Association stand united in this. These are core principles to begin this discussion in Minnesota about extreme gun violence and mental illness. Mr. Chair, members, as I said, we have an epidemic of untreated mental illness in the U.S. and right here in Minnesota. We estimate about 25% of all adults have a diagnosable mental illness, but only about half of them get treatment. And in Minnesota, we have the lowest number of psychiatric beds in the nation, 3.9 per 100,000 population. We are last in the nation. 14.1 is the average. The recommendation is about 50 per 100,000. And I will say this, and I'll repeat it if I have to, but when treated, the mentally ill are no more likely to become violent than the general population. We feel very strongly about this. This is not to disparage those who suffer from mental illness. We want to see them get treatment. We want them to see those folks get help. But studies and experience have shown us that as police officers, that the untreated are significantly more likely to become violent and or become victims of crime. And 8 of the 9 alleged killers in mass shootings in the United States in 2012 had a history of mental illness or untreated mental illness, including the shooter at Accent Signage. Now, last week I had a chance out in D.C. to meet with the President and others, to meet with the police chiefs from Newtown, Connecticut, and Aurora, Colorado, Oak Creek, Wisconsin, and right here in Minneapolis, Minnesota. We talked about these issues. For Minnesota, this has become a public health issue as well as a public safety issue, and law enforcement needs greater access to mental health records when appropriate. The Minnesota Sheriff's Association and my office outlined those 5 possible reforms the legislature should consider as it relates to gun violence and mental illness. Representative Schoen and others who have signed on to this bill have taken really the first crack at that, and now looking to you to help, I think, help craft it and debate it and discuss it as it moves through the public policy process. Mr. Chair, members, when law enforcement does a background check for critical information about the applicant's mental health stability, and if they've been deemed dangerous to themselves or the public by a court, Representative Schoen's bill takes another step. Even if they aren't committed by the court to be dangerous to themselves or others, it allows for a doctor's letter on the applicant's mental state to be considered as grounds for denial of a permit. And I know this bill will be one of the many in this committee that you're going to hear over the next several days, as I said. But again, this discussion had to start somewhere. I think it's safe to say that law enforcement, chiefs, sheriffs, line officers are going to be here. We want to help you provide subject matter experts. We want to help you figure out what the right thing to do is on behalf of Minnesota. Mr. Chair, members, thank you very much for your time this morning.
Thank you for your testimony, Sheriff. Any questions? Representative Cornish.
Mr. Chair and Sheriff Stanek, I agree, and I was at your conference the other day, and more has to be done on the mental health issue, and it's good of you to start that conversation. However, the bill has got some real serious flaws in it, and the problem is current law already allows a sheriff to prohibit a person from getting a permit to carry a permit if they can prove it with facts. In other words, the way it used to be, and previous to this, on the old handgun permit law, a sheriff or a chief could deny it on a whim. Now, I think with ICRs or with reports of bad behavior, you can keep it. Now, probably true, you can keep them from getting it less time, and they've got a right to appeal it, and there are certain things that the sheriff probably don't like about that appeal and having to pay for it. But it's a system that's already set up where you can deny. The problem is, why in the world would a doctor put his or her neck on the line here? It says if you've had contacts and you've restricted somebody from getting a permit, you could keep him from getting a permit longer if the doctor, or you could get the permit back if the doctor would say that they're okay. I can't imagine a doctor putting his or her signature on something that will allow somebody to get a permit back just out of the goodness of their heart and worry about the lawsuits would come if something ever did happen. And so, and nothing against doctors or anything, but you can get them probably to write anything you want for them nowadays in certain respects. Just for a few examples, a handicap sticker, you can get one walking in with just about nothing. Crossbow permit in the DNR, you can get one, or an eye defect for having a scope and muzzle loaders. I've seen doctors just write out permits like candy. And so you would get a variance in the issuance of them. I agree that mental health is really an issue and we need to work on it, but the barrier putting up here for a doctor to stick his neck on the line to get somebody back their rights really worries me. And when you've already got a permit procedure in place that keeps you from getting these prohibited people like this. I mean, if you have a person that's assaulting his wife or a number of domestic disturbances, a pattern of them, or a pattern of mental health or seeing stars move, I think currently you can keep them from getting a permit, can't you, Sheriff?
Sheriff Stanek,
Mr. Chair, members, that was a
couple of questions.
But let me say this, and I've had this conversation with Representative Cornish, so I just want to reiterate. I appreciate his perspective on this. And again, we're simply trying to begin the discussion and let the very smart people, you on that side of the table, figure this out. But let me say this. One thing I know about the background checks, you're right, Representative Cornish. Law enforcement does do those background checks primarily through the NICS system, the National Instant Criminal Background Check. Two components to it, mental health and conviction data. But we know that only 12 states on a regular basis contribute to the mental health piece. 12 states out of 50. Even Minnesota didn't start doing it until 2010. And secondly, conviction data, about 25% conviction data is in that federal database. Means I got a 1 in 4 chance of getting it right now. When you come to me and you ask me for a permit to carry, or you go to your local police chief for a permit to purchase, those are the background checks that we do. We have a lot of work to do here in Minnesota, and again, there is no one easy answer to this. But I just want folks to understand that you got to stay at the table. You got to keep working this out until you get it right. Law enforcement is relying on it. I think the people of Minnesota are relying on it. Mr. Chair,
thank you. Representative Newberger.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Sheriff Stanek, I have a question for you. And also Representative Schoen, perhaps you can answer this. I'm looking at this here, and I'm wondering, Section 115, it says here, when the applicant has had past police contacts that indicate dangerous or violent behavior, chemical dependency, serious mental illness, or a physical condition involving mental incompetence, the chief of police or sheriff, as a condition of the granting the permit, may require the applicant to obtain a letter from a physician, and it goes on, or a mental health professional. How are you going to address the fact that the large proportion of people in our society who have mental illness who can't afford this? So now I've got to go to my doctor, I've got to make an appointment, I've got to pay for a medical evaluation, a mental health evaluation, which is not cheap. How is that going to be addressed? Because right now what you're doing is you're creating, again, a second class of citizens. If you don't have the money, you can't get the exam. If you can't get the exam, you can't have your Second Amendment rights. I think that's a hole in this bill that needs to be addressed. The other thing here is that you have, it's built in, it's subjective, where you have the police, by default, they are ordering people if you have had past police contacts, now you are being, in essence, ordered to see a psychiatrist if you want to get a permit. I want to know what your thoughts are on that, number one. And number two, I want to know who's going to pay for these for the people that don't have the money.
Representative Schoen or Sheriff Stanek, whoever wants to.
Well, briefly, in order to become a law enforcement officer, you have to go through a mental health evaluation as well. But one of the things, I'd be happy to answer more detailed questions related to that, but I think it's imperative with our limited time that we probably get to the public testifiers, because we're all going to be here tonight.
Okay.
And that's what I'd like to move forward with, if that's okay with you.
That would be fine. Representative Newberg, are you okay with that? I don't want to cut you off.
Sure.
Okay. Okay, well, Mr. Franklin, do you have anything else you want to add, or are you here for...
Just, we would like to say, Jim Franklin, Executive Director for the Sheriff's Association. We look at this as an opportunity to work with our mental health advocates in the state to put together something that we believe will make a difference. And secondly, as you know, our jails are full of people, and we look at that as an opportunity. As they are released from the jail, we can begin that rebuilding process to make sure they're mentally taken care of and physically sent out the door with the tools that they need for recovery. So we look at it from the standpoint, as soon as they come in, it's part of the turnaround and recovery part that we hope to improve.
Mr. Franklin, Sheriff Stanek, thank you for your testimony. And we wanted to provide at least 10, 15 minutes for some mental health representatives: Sue Abderholden, Anna McClarity, Trish Stark, Patty Brittany Stark, Stefano Laverso. If you're in the other room, if you could come in. But before we ask you to testify, are there any opponents of Representative Schoen's bill that would like to testify now? Please come up.
Mr. Chair?
Representative Cornish?
Real quick while he's coming up, just on line 4.29, even after the person gets a letter from the doctor saying that they might be okay, if you can get it, the sheriff still doesn't have to take that and issue the permit. It's still their prerogative, which sent us back into the dark ages before we had this current permit system. So.
Representative Schoen, do you want? Was that a comment or a question?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you for your input.
No, so I mean, this is good. We're good. This is the start of a discussion. So, if you could, Mr. Rager, introduce yourself again for the
Chairman. Chris Rager with the National Rifle Association. I agree with Sheriff Stanek that there needs to be something done to make sure that there aren't gaps in the background check system, and that we make sure that people who are disqualified by certain mental health adjudications are getting those records to the background check system. And I think that's something that the committee could work on in a bipartisan way. But I think what HVAL 240 does is basically turn the right not only to possess a firearm but to carry a firearm back to a discretionary type of system here in Minnesota. So taking Minnesota from a shall issue system back into a may issue system, you've got a subjective mental health disqualifier that's basically triggered on past contacts with the police. So I'm not really sure what that would mean. What that would mean if when a teenager you were kind of a rowdy guy, and the police officer knows your name, the issuing officer knows your name, and then he has a reason to deny you or reason to force you to go to get a doctor's note to exercise a constitutionally protected right. That obviously causes us some concern, and as was mentioned by Representative Cornish, I think it was, the issuing officer then would receive that note and could basically become a doctor to determine whether or not he should grant you the permit. So it kind of seems like you're losing your right to possess and carry a firearm before any type of adjudication again. So there is a concern with due process there. The bill also weakens the appeal processes. It actually makes it easier for the issuing officer to deny a law-abiding citizen a permit. And let's mention for a second that Minnesota's in the minority when it comes to requiring their residents to have a permit to simply exercise the core of the Second Amendment, and that's to possess a firearm in your home. You have to go to the government to ask for permission to be able to exercise that right. And that's That's something that I think it's close to 30 states don't require there to be a permit to possess a firearm in the home, but that's a completely separate issue. So like I said, it weakens the appeal processes. It strengthens the ability to deny people a permit. And there's actually a provision in there that really has nothing to do with the rest of the provisions, and it strikes the ability for a non-resident of Minnesota to get a permit to carry in Minnesota. So if you were visiting your family or your friends, or you're on vacation in Minnesota and you wanted to be able to protect yourself and you're from another state and you weren't able to get a permit from another state, but you wanted to get a permit in Minnesota, you would no longer have the ability to do that. So those are just a couple of the issues that we have a problem with in this bill, and I'm obviously more than willing to work with Representative Schoen to see if there's some real solutions that we can work on, like strengthening the background check system or plugging the holes on reporting of mental health information to the next background check system. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rager. Is there anyone else who wants to speak in opposition to this specific bill? Please state your name for the record.
Doug Brown. I'm from Hutchinson, Minnesota.
Welcome to the committee.
Thank you. The concern I have is with the past police contacts, what does that really mean? And what's the criteria and the training that police would have for those contacts? A person could be picked up or off on the side of the road, for instance, have a stroke or have a mini stroke and be acting very peculiar, and the next thing you know, that person is being denied to get a permit because he was acting in a peculiar manner. Then that person, because they're not given due process, would have to go out and get evaluated by a mental health person, and even with a letter from a mental health person coming back to the police chief or the sheriff, would be able to bring that letter back to the sheriff, but the sheriff or police officers there could deny that permit even after that, the way the language is written up here. The police are charged with enforcing the law, not evaluating mental health of an individual. The new language, past police contacts indicate dangerous or violent behavior, chemical dependency, serious mental illness, or physical condition involving mental incompetence. This presupposes that police are competent evaluators of a person's condition. The way the bill is currently written, it really sidelines a person's due process. I was reviewing the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders, and they have a caution in their manual that the use by people without clinical training can lead to inappropriate applications. The above statement really clearly identifies the pitfalls of the way the language is written today. I agree that we need to do more on mental health. I agree with Richard Stanek, and I agree with a lot of the police officers that we need to do more with mental health and being able to do that. But at the same time, we can't compromise the due process of an individual. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony. The next up, please.
Thank you. My name is David Gross. I'm the treasurer of the Gun Owners Civil Rights Alliance. I used to be a prosecutor. I've been a defense attorney. In fact, at one time I even used to legally advise Rich Stanek when he was a police officer in Minneapolis, and I was an assistant city attorney there. And it's kind of fun to keep running across him. I think he's a pretty thoughtful guy. And there are some holes in the background check system, but they're in the execution, not in the design of the system, I think. And I think that's what Sheriff Stanek is saying, is that we're falling flat on the execution, not the design, and yet all of a sudden we're changing the design and how it's applied, and wondering if we shouldn't give it a chance to work properly, to put some effort into it so that the information flows as designed, rather than saying, well, we're not following through and making sure that the information flows properly, so let's redesign the system. My concern is due process of law. I mean, we are talking about a constitutional right, a fundamental individual constitutional right, Heller versus Washington. And now, on the last bill, we had a situation where a police officer, law enforcement officer signs a transport, I think, was it a transport hold and based on, I mean, this is not a professional judgment, to have the person evaluated, and then that professional evaluates, kicks the person loose, no problem, or if there is a problem, they petition for commitment. And yet that temporary evaluation issue, that becomes a confinement that's disabling. That's a violation of due process. What is being suggested here is even worse, because we still have a non-professional taking police contact information, just ICR report stuff. I have a report from 1984 based on a neighbor who didn't like me when I was cleaning my M1 Garand in my backyard so the smell of the solvent wouldn't bother my wife in the house. Man with a gun call, and I'm the suspect. That will show up. You know how I know that? Remember back in the day when the multi-jurisdictional network organization was in play? Found illegal by Don Gemberling? I'm the guy who got into that database through the open screen door on the side of the wall where they had this beautiful vault, and I looked at my information, and I saw that police contact. Big S. Suspect. Man with a gun. All right. Could that happen? And then I'm forced into the very uncomfortable position of having to say, my psychiatrist says I'm not crazy. All right? How would you react to that at a party? By the way, my psychiatrist says I'm not crazy. Whoa. And then the police chief, who's not a trained professional, not only can deny that individual on the basis of this police contact, which might be generated by a politically prejudiced call, and in derogation of a professional's opinion say, well, that doesn't matter. The professional doesn't know what he's talking about. I know better because I'm the police chief or the sheriff. Can I suggest that that is backwards, upside down, and inside out, dysfunctional, counterproductive? Yes, let it be the start of a discussion, as Sheriff Stanek suggests. It's someplace to start. And looking at this provision, we know precisely what not to do. Nothing is completely worthless. It can always serve as a bad example. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gross, for your testimony. We have one more testifier, and then we're going to turn it over to our next group of testifiers. Please state your name for the record.
Good morning. My name is Tim Bender. I'm a deputy sheriff, a line patrolman for Beltrami County up north of Bemidji. And Mr. Gross is a very difficult act to follow. But I just have a few points. First of all, I don't disagree with Sheriff Stanek. I am not here representing my department. I'm not here representing my boss. I'm here on my own. I do have a couple of notes. It was talked about the mental health evaluations that police officers are required to submit to before they are hired. I understand there are at least two. One, when they go through a law enforcement school, they pay for that. They take an MMPI. That's part of their tuition. My son, who's a student at Hibbing, just complained about that this fall. The second evaluation is by the department. I took one in 1990 when I originally got licensed by Beltrami County. That was paid for by the department as a condition of my employment. So if we were talking about who can afford to have these evaluations done, and as a law enforcement officer, I wasn't expected to pay for mine as a condition of employment. It was done by my employer. A second point I'd like to talk about, we talk about the people who wear the tinfoil hats, who hear voices, who are having active hallucinations. You talk to the beat officers who work a precinct, you talk to the deputies who work a patrol area, we all know who they are. The sheriff may not know them, we know who they are, They don't try to buy guns through subjecting themselves to NICS checks. They have had, I can't think of a person who I have dealt with more than once who does not also have a mental health or social services contact. And if the system were to allow that information to flow more freely from the social services or the mental health providers to law enforcement, I think that would be a good thing. I do want to also make a couple of points about the types of calls that become repeated violent contacts or violent situations. I put that in quotes because we get calls all the time where there might be a fight going on and somebody says, well, you got to hurry, they have a gun. Oh, so we hurry and we find out that there was no weapon involved. The people just wanted us there quicker. And that's how we respond. So now what happens is the call goes as a weapon call, and the suspect is the suspect in a weapons call, much like Mr. Gross talked about himself. As often as not, we will get calls where the complainants are talking to me that they're scared of their neighbors. Their neighbors are crazy. And we find out that the dispute is over the neighbor's dog coming into their yard and, well, for lack of a better term, taking a crap on the lawn, and that's what the fight's about. So are you expecting my boss to deny a permit to somebody because their dog takes a crap on the neighbor's lawn? I mean, I guess that's the kind of calls that I feel and that I believe will make it to this determination by a police chief or by a sheriff when there's already a system in place where a judge can hear facts as were stated before.
Thank you, Deputy Sheriff, for your testimony. Representative Schoen, real quickly, and then
I think we need to make clear that when we talk about professional evaluations that, I have Public Safety Director Woolery from Cottage Grove, Public Safety Director Lee Vague from Woodbury, who are professionals, and I think when the professional police officers go out to that call, and to quote this gentleman about a call that would, a dog crapping on the lawn, I think that the professional police chiefs can evaluate by reading the report and determine that that's not an issue that would be a problem related to this bill. I just wanted to make that clear.
Very good. Thank you. So we'll now hear from some of the mental health advocates. First on the list is Sue Abderholden from NAMI. I do intend on recessing at 12, so we have about 20 minutes, members.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. My name is Sue Abderholden, and I'm the Executive Director of NAMI Minnesota, the National Alliance on Mental Illness, and I have with me NAMI's Criminal Justice Director, Anna McClafferty. And we're pleased to have the opportunity to testify today on what is obviously a very difficult subject. NAMI understands the desire to respond in the wake of tragedies like the Sandy Hook shooting to prevent such a tragedy from happening again. We, too, want to prevent these events from happening and to live in safe communities. We don't want people with mental illness to take their own lives or the lives of others. But targeting people who live with serious mental illnesses is unlikely to have a significant impact on reducing gun violence. The vast majority of people living with mental illnesses are not violent. We need to de-link violence and mental illnesses, especially in light of how common they are. 1 in 4 adults live with a mental illness in any given year, and about 4% experience a serious mental illness, which could include things such as bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, and major depression. Having an untreated serious mental illness can, in some cases, increase the risk of violence, especially for people who are also using substances. However, only 5% of violent acts, including shootings, are committed by people with mental illnesses, according to the Institute of Medicine. When you take that into consideration, perhaps it's not surprising that we have yet to see research demonstrating that expanding gun restrictions for people with serious mental illnesses prevents gun violence. Minnesota statutes already prevent people who've been committed due to being in danger of hurting themselves or others or unable to take care of themselves from accessing guns. Other than using the Commitment Act, there is no reliable way to predict violence. Police holds and 72-hour holds are not diagnostic tools. They do not tell you that someone is actually living with a mental illness or really that they'll even be violent. We all know there are problems with the Commitment Act in terms of its interpretation across different judges and different screening teams, but that really is a different issue. So instead of searching for needles in a haystack in terms of preventing people with mental illnesses who have not been committed or convicted of a crime from purchasing guns, we believe Minnesota needs instead to look at ensuring real access to mental health treatment. An important question might be, why don't people seek treatment? Only 39% of people who live with a mental illness receive treatment in any given year. Stigma and barriers to access are two enormous factors. Combined, these problems lead people to wait an average of 10 years before seeking mental health treatment. Focusing on people with mental illnesses in debates like this one risks further stigmatizing people with mental illnesses, discouraging them from seeking treatment voluntarily. And stigma causes harm in other ways, too. A survey published just last week in the New England Journal of Medicine found that 46% of respondents said they believe those with serious mental illnesses are more dangerous than others. 71% said they wouldn't want to work closely with a person who had a mental illness, and 67% said they wouldn't want a neighbor to have one. Accessing care can be extremely difficult due to lack of coverage, funding, and workforce shortages. Private health plans are not required to cover mental health care. Parity just says if you cover it, you do it in the same way. And Medicaid and Medicare discriminate as well, not covering mental health treatment in the same way. And even if your insurance does cover treatment, the wait for an appointment is 3 months minimum and often longer to see a psychiatrist. Both children and adults are too often released from psychiatric hospitalization to shelters or homelessness because there aren't enough services in the community. The consequences of delayed treatment are great. There are poor outcomes, such as dropping out of school, being unemployed, or homeless. And suicide is the 10th leading cause of death in the U.S., taking 38,000 lives each year, more than double the number of lives lost to homicide. In Minnesota alone, we lose over 500 people to suicide. To prevent suicide and the tiny percentage of people who are at risk of hurting others, the one thing we can do is improve earlier identification of and treatment for mental illnesses. In particular, Minnesota needs more programs for people having their first episode of psychosis. Psychosis can mean hallucinations, delusions, or both. First episode of psychosis programs provide individual and family education, intensive therapy, support groups, and they help the person engage in education or employment. The psychiatrist who devised the original first episode program said that kids who go on gun rampages tend to be pre-psychotic. They still have enough functioning to methodically plot out their attacks, but they've lost their capacity for judgment, but not for planning. If we look at several of the shooters in the last couple of years, they had had no contact with the police, no transporting to a hospital, no 72-hour holds. They weren't on anybody's radar screen. In addition to first episode of psychosis programs, we need to beef up our community-based programs in both the children and adult systems. And I want to say we don't believe we need more outpatient beds. People spend a tiny percentage of their lives in inpatient. They spend the majority of their life in the community. And if all you do is put people in beds, you will not solve this problem at all. We need to have schooling to mental health programs, respite care, care coordination, supportive housing, supportive employment, and more. As many of you know, yesterday nearly a dozen bills were introduced to address the children's mental health system, and I hope that you look carefully at them and decide to support them. And I'd like to turn it over to Anna.
Thank you for your testimony.
I'm Anna McLafferty, Criminal Justice Director at NAMI, and like Sue, I understand the desire to prevent guns from getting into the wrong hands. However, to the extent that mental illnesses play a role here, the answers really do lie in making sure that people can get access to the mental health care that they need. It's telling that in the corrections world, mental illnesses are not considered at all when measuring someone's risk of recidivism, violent or not. In Minnesota, corrections agencies rely on an evidence-based risk assessment tool called the Level of Service Case Management Inventory, or LSCMI, to assess a person's risk of reoffending. And this tool doesn't weigh whether someone lives with a mental illness simply because the research does not bear out that there's enough of a connection between mental illnesses and recidivism, again, violent or not. This committee can make a big difference when it comes to Minnesota's approach to people living with mental illnesses, but the real issue isn't guns. It's making sure that people have access to the treatment and services they need so they stop cycling through the criminal justice system. 56% of people in prison and 64% of people in jails live with mental illnesses. far greater percentages than the 1 in 4 numbers that you heard from Sue. When it comes to mental illnesses and criminal justice, we ask you to focus on a few other issues. First, law enforcement training. Crisis Intervention Team, or CIT training, is a 40-hour training that teaches law enforcement officers to recognize and understand mental illnesses and connect people to appropriate mental health services in the community and verbally de-escalate a mental health crisis. The goal is to reduce use of force, reduce injury to both officers and people experiencing crises, and ensure that people are connected to appropriate mental health services in the community. Second, mental health courts. These courts hold people accountable for both their actions and for addressing their underlying mental health needs instead of the traditional approach of just addressing the person's actions. Outcomes vary from one court to the next, but they consistently reduce recidivism. And third, jail and prison release planning to help people navigate the complex process of leaving a correctional facility and going back into the community. Stearns County measures the recidivism rates for its program in its local jail and has found that people come back to the jail 73% less often in the 2 years after compared to the 2 years before release planning in that county. Finally, as far as guns go, we ask that this committee not hone in on people living with mental illnesses any more than the law already does. We do agree that law enforcement and gun dealers as well should be required to check civil commitment records, findings that someone's incompetent to stand trial, and verdicts of not guilty by reason of mental illness. But that information is already readily available in the Minnesota Court Information System. It's very easy to access, it's available to the public, and it should be easy for officers to access it quickly when they need it as well. And we also support Representative Winkler's bill to allow people to voluntarily add themselves to a registry of people ineligible for guns. Many people we talk to would add themselves to such a registry, assuming it was absolutely not available to public audiences like landlords or employers, and so on. We don't, however, support any kind of broader registry of people with mental illnesses, since it would, like Sue said, discourage people from seeking treatment when they need it, and it would take rights away from a class of people without any kind of due process. With that, thank you for your time, and we'd be glad to answer any questions, either now or once.
Thank you for your testimony. Next.
Good morning. I'm Dr. Tricia Stark. I'm a licensed psychologist, and I work for the Minnesota Psychological Association, and I am also in private practice. When events such as those at Newtown, Connecticut, or Aurora, Colorado happen, we look to find answers to prevent future tragedies. House File 240 is an attempt to keep guns out of the hands of those perceived to be at risk of completing violence. However, it is based on a misapprehension of the causes for violence. The factors that converge related to violent acts are complex and interrelated. But studies repeatedly find that mental illness does not cause violence. And I'm going to say that again. Mental illness does not cause violence. What major prospective studies demonstrate is that violence can be best predicted when a number of factors are considered. These factors include dispositional, historical, clinical, and contextual factors. Factors related to severe violence include younger age, male sex, having less than a high school diploma, a past history of violence, juvenile detention, perception of hidden threats from others, and being divorced or separated in the last year. In terms of the strength of predictors, from the most influential to the least, factors are younger age, a past history of violence, being male, a history of juvenile detention, recent divorce or separation, history of physical abuse as a child, parental criminal history, unemployment in the last year, having a major mental illness and substance abuse, but neither one on its own, and having been victimized in the last year. It's necessary to look beyond the mental health diagnosis and look at an individual's prior history and what is transpiring now in their lives. Returning to House File 240, it's overly broad and will deprive too many individuals of rights while failing to identify those at most risk. It is reasonable to consider someone at risk who has severe mental illness and substance abuse and a past history of violence. Such an additive approach can appropriately address risk. Using a standardized assessment of risk, such as the classification of violence risk, could increase accuracy while ensuring that individuals with mental illness are not inappropriately targeted, leading to increased stigma. Such an approach might also avoid the unintended consequences of dissuading individuals with mental health concerns or substance abuse from pursuing life-saving and enhancing treatment for the fear of loss of rights. Research does provide information about the kind of interventions that can reduce the likelihood of violence, including providing support and mental health services for children, and some dynamic factors that change over time can be addressed through the provision of integrated dual disorder treatments, vocational services, supported employment, increasing the availability of mental health services for families in crisis, and enhancing services for victims of crime. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony. Did you want to testify? Okay. We have only got a few minutes left.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to testify. My name is Patty Bitney Stark. I'm the Executive Director of the Mental Health Consumer Survivor Network of Minnesota. And I'd like to say before I begin that I would like to thank all of the members of the military in this room for their service to this country. On behalf of CSN, I am here today to share some extreme concerns that we have. I hear everyone regarding the bills that are before this committee talking about those that are mentally ill. Some people refer to them as crazy, some people refer to them as nuts, and there's been some discussion about a need for more beds. At CSN, we refer to people with a mental health challenge as those having had a lived experience. And one of the things that we know about individuals who've had a lived experience with a mental health challenge is that they could get well and stay well with the right resources, as opposed to identifying that people who have a mental health challenge and a severe one shouldn't have be able to bear arms. What we're saying is that we need resources made available to those people as other people have. But one of the things that I would like to say regarding the power of language, and I thank you, Jim, for your information. People with a lived experience have been second-class citizens in this country for decades and centuries. We no longer are going to lock those people away in state institutions, although there are 2 in Minnesota that are very concerning to the Consumer Survivor Network. The other concern that we have is that if you have to disclose whether or not you have a mental health challenge, whether it's to law enforcement or an employment agency, you are perceived as less than. And there's no doubt about the impact that that has. And on behalf of the Mental Health Consumer Survivor Network, it is imperative, as I speak at this desk today, representing thousands and thousands and thousands of citizens in the state of Minnesota that have had a mental health challenge, that I make it very clear to the people in this committee and in this audience that all of those people certainly do want to recover and get well. Many of them don't because they lack resources. Many of them don't because they don't know where to access resources. And many, many, many veterans don't access mental health resources because of the stigma that comes with that and their fear for their loss of their right to bear arms. I work with those veterans and have for decades. And I also want to say, what do we do at CSN? We offer an evidence-based practice that's recognized by SAMHSA called Wellness Recovery Action Plan training. We know that it helps people get well and stay well. We've got warm lines that people can call if they're in duress. And the other thing that we do is that we want to speak on behalf of everyone. And finally, I want to say, on behalf of many people in this room that know me, that I am that face of mental illness. I am the one that some people in this room have called crazy. I have been gainfully employed at the top levels of government, federal and state. I've been executive director of multiple organizations, and I am that face that you call crazy. I am not. I have recovered and I am well from my many mental health diagnoses. And I want everyone to be very, very careful about the language that they use, because on behalf of on behalf of all consumers in the state of Minnesota, consumers of mental health services and those that don't. You are talking about us, and we will no longer allow that kind of language to be used. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony. Sir, you have like 2 minutes. I'm afraid we have to end. So.
I will make it in that time. Okay. I will be brief. Thank you, Mr. Chair and committee members. I am Stefano Laverso, Communications Coordinator for Vale Place. Forgive me, I'm dealing with a cold. A community support program for people with serious and persistent mental illnesses. Vale Place serves about 1,800 people a year, providing community-based services that allow them to live independently and successfully in the community. In the over 12 years that I've been at Vale Place, I have heard of only one incident of violence. That was an individual who hit a case manager. In the face of so much coverage linking mental illness and violence, that must seem like an anomaly. But it's not. It's not, because most people with mental illness are not violent. And when they receive the appropriate services and support, violence is even more rare. We fully appreciate the desire of law enforcement and everybody in our community to feel safe. We agree that keeping guns out of the hands of people with a history of violence is a good strategy to meet that goal. We don't agree with indiscriminately targeting people with mental illnesses as violent. The provisions that I noted, I wanted to mention provisions in both House File 237 and House File 240 that single out broadly people with mental illnesses as being potentially dangerous and would deny them their constitutional rights. And I believe that they would potentially stigmatize people with mental illnesses and contribute to keeping them from seeking treatment, and when they do seek treatment, being far less likely to speak openly about any history of violence or thoughts of violence. The best approach to preventing or at least reducing the very small percentage of violence that is committed by people with mental illnesses is to intervene as early as possible and provide access to appropriate services and ongoing support. Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you for the testimony. Representative Schoen, I'll give you a minute if you want to wrap this up, then we're going to recess.
All right, Mr. Chair, members, what I want to point out is that this bill is one piece, one microcosm in the entire piece of this safety legislation that we're going to be talking about. I couldn't agree more that the mental health parity and the issues that we need to take care of in health and human services area is extremely important, and I support it. We need to make sure that those folks need the care no matter who they are. This bill is not about trying to persuade people not to obtain firearms. It's about persuading them to obtain the treatment and the service that they need. When a local law enforcement official has seen some sort of action in their own community that they know better than anybody else and says, give me one more step and show me that everything's fine. And if they did get that treatment in that facility during a 72-hour hold or whatever it may be, maybe that's enough.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Representative Schoen. To the members, to the people in the audience, if you did fill out some written testimony, the pages will collect them. If you want to speak about these two bills or the three bills that are on the agenda for this evening, we will be back here at 6 o'clock. All of the bills are posted online if you would like to read them. Thank you all for your respectful discussion. This meeting is in recess until 6 o'clock.